Hello, third graders. I wanted to continue with our story, Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball by Debbie Dady and Marsha Thornton Jones. I wanted to read chapter 3 today. Before we go on to chapter 3, I would like to review chapter 2. We met a new character, Howie. Howie is Eddie's best friend. That's what Eddie had said. And one of the other things that I noticed about Howie was that he seemed to be afraid of Mrs. Jeepers. I know that because he warned Eddie about Mrs. Jeepers turning him into bat bait if he kept up his pranks. Liza also seemed to be afraid of Mrs. Jeepers, and so did Eddie. So that might be something that we are continuing to think about as we are reading in the story. Also, there was something interesting in chapter 2. I'm wondering if Mrs. Jeepers has some kind of superpowers because when Eddie was trying to cut Liza's hair, that the scissors seemed to be frozen, like Mrs. Jeepers was controlling it. So that's something to think about as well. So, thinking about a summary for chapter 2, again, thinking about previously in Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball, or Somebody Wanted But So Then model can help us with the summary. So, Eddie is a troublemaker. I know this because he has all kinds of things in his desk that show he doesn't follow the rules. Eddie wanted to cut loose and play tricks because it was St. Patrick's Day. He tried to cut Liza's hair, but Eddie's scissors seemed to be frozen. When he looked up, Mrs. Jeepers was rubbing her green brooch and smiling her odd smile. So Eddie thought he would cut loose during gym time and pushed Howie into the girls' bathroom on the way. Then Howie warned Eddie that he would get in trouble with Mrs. Jeepers. That scared Eddie, and he was quiet until he got to gym. So let's think about chapter 3. Chapter 3 is called Mr. Potato Head, and my thought was, who is Mr. Potato Head? Let's get started. Chapter 3, Mr. Potato Head. In the gym, a very short man wearing a red sweatsuit and green high-top tennis shoes stood beside their gym teacher. The stranger was so short he only came up to the waistband of Coach Ellison's pea green sweatsuit. The little man made Coach Ellison look like the jolly green giant. "Who's the peanut?" Eddie asked Howie. "He looks like something that fell out of Santa's sleigh." "Yeah," Howie agreed, "and I think he fell on his face." The boys looked at the tiny man's face. He had more lines on it than watermelons had seeds. Liza whispered, "I bet he's 1,000,000 years old." "This guy is definitely a good candidate for a facelift," Melody giggled. "Yes," Liza agreed, "but he has a nice smile. He reminds me of my grandpa." "I bet your grandpa doesn't carry a marble bag." Eddie pointed to a small leather pouch hanging from the stranger's waistband. He knew it was the kind that held marbles. Coach Ellison interrupted them. "Boys and girls, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. O'Grady. He's a teacher from Ireland." "Top of the morning, lads and lassies." Mr. O'Grady's eyes darted from face to face. Coach Ellison slapped Mr. O'Grady on the back. "We're very lucky to have Mr. O'Grady visiting for a few days. He'll be teaching a lesson on Irish folk dancing." With that, Coach Ellison left for the teacher's lounge. Some of the kids groaned, but not Eddie. "This will be great," he whispered to Howie. "A brand new teacher to drive batty." I'm going to go back and look at that picture of Mr. O'Grady and Coach Ellison. He is pretty short. He does kind of look like a leprechaun. Howie shook his head. "Mr. O'Grady looks like he's been around the block a few times. He might not be as easy as Coach Ellison." Eddie laughed. "How much trouble can a man the size of Mr. Potato Head be?" Just then, Mr. Potato Head started talking with an Irish accent. "Children, it's delighting me to be your coach and friend." Mr. O'Grady's voice had a ring to it that sounded like birds singing on a spring morning, but Eddie wasn't bothering to listen. He didn't want to waste precious time listening to a guy who wasn't tall enough to get ice cream out of the freezer. First, Eddie squeaked his tennis shoes on the wooden floor. Sounded like he'd eaten too many beans. Eddie giggled, but no one else seemed to notice. They were too busy listening to the strange sounding shrimp in the red sweatsuit. He was talking about doing a dance. What a sissy thing, Eddie thought. Eddie wasn't the least bit interested, so he turned his attention to Melody. She was listening to Mr. O'Grady like he was giving the answers to tomorrow's math test. Quietly, Eddie crept up behind her and tied her green shoestrings together in a double knot. Then he stood back to watch the action. Now let us be trying to jig, Mr. O'Grady said. All the third graders moved to their assigned places. Melody moved too, but her feet didn't go along. Kerplunk! Melody fell on the floor with a thud. Ow! She wailed as Mr. O'Grady ran up to help her. What has happened to this beautiful lassie? Mr. O'Grady asked. Melody sniffed and pointed at Eddie. He made me fall! Oh, me lucky charms! Mr. O'Grady smiled. I did not think I'd be a-finding an imp so quickly. He's an imp, all right, Melody snarled as she untangled her shoes. He's always causing trouble. Let's not be too hasty to pass judgment on him, Mr. O'Grady said. Sometimes much can be gained by tricks. And he felt goosebumps cover his arms and neck. He wasn't used to a teacher being cheerful after one of his pranks. Gee, Howie whispered as Mr. O'Grady helped Melody off the floor. He doesn't get mad very easily. We'll see about that, Eddie snapped. If there's one thing I know, it's how to make teachers mad. Howie didn't hear Eddie because Mr. O'Grady started the record player. The lilting music of fiddles and flutes filled the gym. Mr. O'Grady put his hands on his hips and started to step to the music. It wasn't long before everybody joined him. Everybody, that is, except Eddie. And that is the end of the chapter. Again, we're seeing a pattern of behavior with Eddie and his mischievous actions. We're also interesting some things about Mr. O'Grady and that he seems to be happy about Eddie's pranks. So we're going to have to think about what is going to happen there.